He ordered fresh roses to be placed on her grave every single week for 20 years. Not once did he miss. Not on holidays, not in snowstorms, not even in the final months when his own body was failing him. 20 years. Every week. Without explanation, without a single public statement. And when he died in 1999, the flower deliveries finally stopped, because the man who had quietly kept ordering them was gone too. But here's what nobody told you. Here's what the archives just confirmed. The grief Joe DiMaggio carried for Marilyn Monroe wasn't just love. It was guilt. It was obsession. It was a story of two people who destroyed each other and couldn't stop reaching back through the wreckage. And the truth, the full truth, is far sadder than any movie has ever dared to show. What makes this story hit differently now is the volume of material that has quietly surfaced through estate disclosures, declassified FBI files, and the posthumous release of private correspondence that DiMaggio's family sat on for decades. Letters, hotel receipts, handwritten notes passed between two people who publicly claim to have moved on. The picture that emerges is not the one Hollywood sold us. It is messier. It is more human. And it is almost unbearably sad once you understand the full timeline of what was happening in the final year of Marilyn Monroe's life, and who was at the center of it, quietly and stubbornly, refusing to let go. We need to go back to the beginning, because the beginning tells you everything. Joe DiMaggio was already a legend when he first saw Marilyn Monroe. This was 1951. He was baseball royalty, the Yankee Clipper, the man who had held a 56-game hitting streak that still hasn't been broken to this day. He had played in 10 World Series. He had won 3 MVP awards. He had been married before, had a son, and had quietly walked away from that first marriage without public drama because DiMaggio was constitutionally incapable of public drama. He kept everything inside. That was his greatest strength as an athlete and his most catastrophic weakness as a human being. And Marilyn Monroe was becoming something America had never quite seen before. She wasn't just beautiful. She was a force of nature in a silk dress. And DiMaggio knew it the moment he saw a photograph of her. He asked to be introduced. She initially said no. Let that land for a second. The most celebrated athlete in the country asked to meet Marilyn Monroe, and she turned him down. That reversal of expectation tells you something important about who Marilyn was. She wasn't chasing fame. She was already it. When they finally did meet in 1952, DiMaggio showed up 90 minutes early to the restaurant. 90 minutes. The man who had played in sold-out stadiums, who had never flinched in a World Series game, sat in that restaurant alone for an hour and a half because he didn't trust himself to arrive calmly and casually. He was terrified. His teammates would never have believed it. But that terror was the first clue that this was different for Joe. Marilyn was different. He wasn't chasing a starlet. He was, for the first time in his life, genuinely in over his head. People at nearby tables quietly recognized him, but said nothing, because something about his posture, the way the great DiMaggio sat alone with a coffee and kept watching the door, made it clear this was not a moment to interrupt. Their courtship lasted 2 years. DiMaggio proposed repeatedly. Marilyn kept saying she needed time. She was focused on her career, determined to be taken seriously as an actress, convinced that marriage would only chain her to someone else's idea of who she should be. She had already survived enough of that, the studio system that had shaped her since she was 19. The contracts that told her what to wear and say and weigh and feel. DiMaggio, who had spent his entire athletic career controlling every variable, found himself completely unable to control this one thing, whether the woman he loved would choose him. That helplessness would define everything that followed. Friends of his said they had never seen him this way. He wasn't the clipper around her. He was just a man. They married on January 14, 1954 at San Francisco City Hall. It was supposed to be the beginning. Within 9 months, it was over. The details of their marriage have been softened and romanticized over the decades. The reality was brutal. DiMaggio was a deeply private man who had grown up in a world where women did not become global sex symbols while their husbands watched from the sidelines. He was a man of rigid expectations and iron pride, and Marilyn, luminous, free-spirited, relentlessly public Marilyn, shattered every one of those expectations on a near-daily basis. He didn't want her to do certain film roles. She did them anyway. He didn't want her to perform in that white dress over a subway grate in New York, while crowds of men screamed below her. She did it anyway. There is footage of that moment that the whole world has seen. Marilyn Monroe laughing as her dress billows up around her, joyful, electric, completely in her element. What the cameras didn't catch was DiMaggio standing off to the side, watching director Billy Wilder film that sequence over and over again, Witnesses said DiMaggio's jaw was locked and his eyes were flat. He was ice cold with a rage he had nowhere to put. The night after that filming, back at their hotel, neighbors reported hearing screaming. Marilyn showed up the next day with bruises on her arms. No formal charges were ever filed. No one in the industry spoke about it openly. This was 1954, a different world, a different calculus of power and silence. But in the weeks that followed, Marilyn Monroe filed for divorce, citing mental cruelty. She stood before reporters with red eyes and a voice that barely held together and told them the marriage was finished. The marriage had lasted 274 days. Here is where the story gets strange. Here is where it becomes something you weren't expecting. After the divorce, DiMaggio did not disappear. He did not move on, remarry, and become a footnote in Marilyn's biography. He stayed. He haunted the edges of her life with a devotion that never fully dimmed, even as Marilyn went on to marry playwright Arthur Miller. Even as her career reached stratospheric heights with Some Like It Hot and Bus Stop, and the films that cemented her as the defining female star of her generation. Even as her personal life descended into chaos and prescription drug dependency, DiMaggio was always somewhere nearby, not possessively, or at least not always, sometimes protectively, sometimes painfully, sometimes both at once. He hired private investigators to watch her. That part is documented. He had people report back to him on who she was seeing, where she was going, whether she was safe. When that detail first emerged publicly, it read as control, as obsession, as the behavior of a man who couldn't release what he'd lost. And it was all of those things. But the people who knew him best said it was also something else. A man who had watched someone he loved begin unraveling, and who didn't know any other way to try to protect her from a distance, except to pay someone to keep eyes on her. Whether that was love or ownership masquerading as love is a question nobody can fully answer. Maybe DiMaggio couldn't answer it himself. When Marilyn was committed to a psychiatric facility in New York in 1961, placed there against her wishes, terrified and confused, locked behind doors she hadn't chosen to walk through, it was DiMaggio who got her out. Not her agents, not her therapists. Not Arthur Miller, from whom she was by then divorced. Not the powerful men whose names she had been linked to in the tabloids. Joe DiMaggio flew to New York, walked into that hospital, and refused to leave without her. He sat across from the facility director and made clear that this was not a negotiation. The staff relented. He checked her out, arranged for her care, and stayed with her through the early days of her recovery. She told friends afterward that he was the only person who had ever truly come for her when she needed someone to come. Not the studio, not the people who had made fortunes from her image. Just Joe, on a plane, already on his way before she'd even finished asking. They were quietly reconciling in the summer of 1962. That detail is not widely known, and it is the detail that makes everything that follows impossible to fully sit with. DiMaggio had proposed again. Sources close to both of them, including her housekeeper Eunice Murray and her therapist Ralph Greenson, whose own conduct around Marilyn's final days has been the subject of deep and ongoing scrutiny, confirmed that Marilyn had accepted. They were going to try again. Older, hopefully wiser, both of them scarred by the years between and the years within. They had a plan. They had a date in mind sometime in the fall. And then on August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom at her Brentwood home, an empty bottle of prescription sleeping pills on the nightstand. She was 36 years old. DiMaggio received the phone call in the early hours of August 5th. The man who had faced down every pressure that professional sports could produce completely fell apart. Those who were with him in those hours said they had never seen anything like it. He wept in a way that seemed to go beyond what the body knows how to handle. He was inconsolable in a way that went beyond grief, and into something that looked like a man whose entire inner architecture had collapsed. Because it had. Whatever future he had been quietly rebuilding in his mind, whatever second chance he had finally allowed himself to hope for, was gone in a single phone call. He took control of everything. He organized the funeral. He flew to Los Angeles and assumed authority over arrangements with a quiet forcefulness that nobody around him thought to challenge. He kept the Hollywood crowd away, the very people he blamed, not without reason, for the environment that had consumed her. Peter Lawford was specifically barred from the service. So were Frank Sinatra and the broader Kennedy-connected circle. DiMaggio never made a public statement about why. He never needed to. People understood. He stood over her casket in the small chapel at Westwood Memorial Park and whispered something to her that no one else could hear. He kissed her. And then he walked out into the Los Angeles sunshine and spent the rest of his life carrying what he could not say out loud to anyone. The roses started the week after she was buried. Every week, without exception, red roses were delivered to her crypt for 20 years. DiMaggio turned down every book deal, every documentary request, every interview about Marilyn. When journalists approached him, he would turn away. When talk show hosts tried to bring her up in the rare public appearances he made, he would go silent in a way that ended the topic immediately. He never spoke her name in public, not once in 20 years. He never needed to. The roses said everything. What the roses didn't say, what has only emerged through private letters and the accounts of close friends, was the full weight of what DiMaggio lived with every single day. He blamed himself for the deterioration of their marriage. He blamed himself for the violence, for his inability to be the man she needed, for pushing her toward a world that ultimately consumed her. He had raised his hand in a moment of rage, and she had filed for divorce, and 8 years later she was dead. And those facts lived inside him like splinters that could never be fully removed. But he also blamed others. He blamed the studio system that had exploited her since she was practically a teenager. He blamed the powerful men who had used her proximity to fame and beauty for their own ends and then left her with nothing but pills and silence. He blamed Hollywood for the way it had consumed a woman it never truly understood and certainly never protected. His anger at those forces was enormous and lifelong. It just had nowhere to go, so it sat inside him, next to the grief, for the rest of his days. In his final years, DiMaggio was frail, battling lung cancer, growing smaller inside the body that had once been the physical embodiment of American athletic perfection. People who visited him in those months said he still kept a photograph of Marilyn in his home. Not in a shrine. Not displayed dramatically in a place of performance. Just there in a quiet part of a room, the way a person keeps something they've stopped needing to explain, because it has simply become part of the structure of who they are. He died on March 8, 1999, in Hollywood, Florida. He was 84 years old. His reported last words, spoken in the final hours, were, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." Whether he said exactly that, whether it is legend or documented fact, almost doesn't matter at this point. The sentiment was true, regardless. Whatever peace he had made with his life, whatever accounting he had finally done of his choices and his failures, and the love he had never been able to either hold on to or fully release, it all came to rest in that room in Florida. The flowers stopped, the long vigil, the quiet, relentless one that nobody had asked him to keep, was over. The tragedy of Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe is not simply that two famous people had a difficult marriage and a bitter divorce. It is something older and more universal than any headline can hold. It is the tragedy of a love that arrives before two people have learned how to carry it without dropping it and breaking something irreplaceable. It is the tragedy of a man who could not become what a woman needed in time to keep her, and who spent the next 4 decades in the wreckage of that failure, unable to walk away from the ruins. It is the tragedy of a woman who kept reaching for safety and kept finding instead another version of a world that wanted to use her image and discard the person underneath it. And it is the tragedy of a second chance, a real one, a genuine one, with a date in the fall and a plan and a quiet kind of hope, that was weeks away from becoming something real when the phone rang in the dark and everything stopped. There is one more detail that deserves its own moment, because it changes the texture of everything else. In the months before Marilyn died, she had begun talking openly to friends about wanting a quieter life. She was exhausted. The performances, the expectations, the relentless machinery of being Marilyn Monroe. She was tired of all of it in a way she hadn't been earlier in her career. She told her friend Ralph Roberts that she wanted a garden. She told her massa she wanted to cook dinner for someone who loved her without needing anything from her. The woman who had become the most photographed person on earth was dreaming about ordinary evenings, about a kitchen, about being someone's person rather than everyone's symbol. DiMaggio, who had built his entire post-baseball life around privacy and quiet, was the only man in her orbit who could have given her exactly that. He wasn't interested in her fame. He had never been interested in her fame. He was interested in her. That was the thing she couldn't find anywhere else, and the thing she was finally, cautiously, letting herself reach for again in the summer of 1962. And then August arrived. This is not a love story with a lesson attached. There is no wisdom here that makes it easier. It is just a love story, the kind that doesn't resolve, that doesn't teach you something you can use, that just sits there in the historical record like a bruise that never healed. Red roses, once a week, for 20 years placed at the grave of a woman by a man who never explained himself to anyone, because the only person he owed an explanation was gone. He already knew that. And so every week, without announcement, without audience, he sent the flowers instead. Some stories don't end, they just go quiet. Stay with us, because the private letters still being authenticated right now may reveal details about their final weeks together that will completely change everything you thought you knew about how this story was always meant to end.